right? Because he ended up building a couple of our more historic hotels in town, as well as working at the train depot, which is, of course, why he was brought here originally. But he chose an interesting structure for the house because that was where he was going to put his family. And he liked to do pretty innovative stuff. Interestingly, the house, it's log cabin construction essentially, right?
Yeah.
And back then they didn't have insulation. So what they actually did to keep the house warm is they braided horsehair and put it between all the logs. So you can go in there today and still see the horsehair sticking to the walls in places. And that's how they actually insulated it. So, yeah.
So that's like 1900s insulation.
Yes. Yeah. Like 1903, early.
Wow.
And so, interestingly enough, I mean, it's really to me, it was surprising at least that, the horsehair is still there. You can still see it and it's still holding up. So it's, I guess it was a good choice.
Yeah.
Quality material.
Awesome.
Right.
So this building was built in the early 1900s by this architect who's from Illinois. And, I kind of dug into the history when we recorded the kind of the intro to this. Feel free to add anything else that you want to of relevance to this. But I also thought it was interesting that this architect designed the Alvarado train station, as well as several other train station related buildings. I think one of the hotels that was close to the rim of the Grand Canyon, he designed that as well. And the Alvarado train station is downtown Albuquerque for those listeners who don't know or who aren't from New Mexico. And it was demolished, but it was rebuilt with another building that looks very similar to the original. And it now serves as a train station for the Rail Runner, which is our commuter train here. Yeah. So I just thought it was kind of cool that he kind of had his hand in other things as well, aside from this building. And it was just an interesting study on what his career was like as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it was interesting the impact it had on his family as well, because, he built the home originally for his kids and his wife, of course, and he would be gone for sometimes weeks and months on end, because when they started calling him to do, designs in other cities, he would go and leave the family at home. So they would be there very often on their own for a really long time. And at that point, there really wasn't a whole lot else in the area. So the house was, the house and the hospital were there and not too much else. So they were kind of on the plains almost, if you will. It was a very, a pretty isolated place. There's actually a really interesting book written by those children as well about their time there, talking about, snakes falling off the rafters and just wildlife and activity around the house. But yeah, it was fascinating. So that's why they eventually ended up moving, though, was because he was being called out so often. And that's what opened it up for somebody else to buy it.
Did you say that there were snakes falling off the rafters?
Yes. There's a great story in there about one of the kids, when he was like 6 years old or something, was sitting in the living room, which is the biggest room in the whole building and always was. It's this huge, long, beautiful living area. And he was sitting in there and they're playing. And a snake, I think it was a rattlesnake, fell off one of the rafters and it crawled in the house and was crawling along the kind of kivas at the top there. And it just fell down and he started playing with it.
Oh, my God.
Because we just didn't know any better.
Right. The beauty of innocence, I guess. So that gives you a sense, though, of definitely, I think, how kind of isolated and rustic it really was.
Just different times completely.
Absolutely.
So I know that once they sold it and the family moved onwards to, I think it was California or wherever they went to next. I know that it changed hands a couple times, the home.
Yes.
And I think it was leased prior to Mrs. M's suitor purchasing it.
Yes, briefly.
Okay.
Yeah. There were a number of times that the property was owned very briefly or leased very briefly to people who would kind of come and go. It's a pretty interesting history when you look at it, because it's changed hands a lot of times. It was, I cannot remember the name of the person who had it previous to Mrs. M, but it was held for a little while, not too very long. And then she became the next owner, who had it for about 40 years, the longest that any one person had owned it, still to this day. And then it went through a few more changes where it was, it's been a home for indigent men It was actually vacant for a little while. It was even a frat house for a couple of years. So it's definitely an interesting history.
Yeah, so it was a frat house, and then the press club bought it, right?
Yes, yeah, the press club bought it, and it's been basically member owned ever since then.
Awesome.
But definitely, definitely Mrs. M's purchase is kind of the favorite story, of course, because of the way that she kind of came into possession of it, I think.
Yeah, I love that story. Do you mind just kind of going through that a little bit?
Absolutely. So Mrs. M, her name, perhaps oddly, was Clifford, was actually her first name. So people called her Cliffy. But she came here originally to work at the hospital because she had a loved one, as we understand it, who she wanted to make sure they were being taken care of. So she came and worked at the hospital originally for them, and then they passed, and she ended up staying on and becoming one of the head nurses there. And at that time, as I said, there really wasn't a lot else around there. So she had a suitor that wanted to marry her, and he asked her many, many times. And I guess she turned him down pretty often. But eventually one day he asked again, and she said, I'll tell you what, if you buy me that beautiful log cabin that I pass by every day on the way to work, then I'll marry you. So he did. Right? I was like, hey, she knew what she wanted. And he agreed. So, so they did. They became married. And they were actually only married for a relatively short time. I want to say it was around possibly 6 years, maybe slightly shorter. I forget off the top of my head, but not real long. But she did end up holding onto the home after they were divorced. And she held it for about 40 years after that, and really turned it into, she really was the reason it became such a cultural touchstone, because, she decorated the home with all these Native American artifacts and kind of Oriental Asian artifacts, many of which actually were left behind by people who had died, either there at the house when they were visiting or over at the hospital. So she had a lot of that in the home. That was her taste. And so that was part of it. But also, like I say, you had these medical professionals coming to visit, and you had athletes and political figures and even artists who would come. Some of New Mexico's well-known artists would come and paint on the front patio because they had this beautiful view of the mountains and everything. So she really made it into that kind of cultural touchstone that it became for that 40 years. But yeah, I love that story too. I love, she she struck a bargain and got a good deal out of it.
I mean,
go ahead.
Buy me a house.
Right?
Sorry to cut you off. I was just gonna say that I love that so much. I think that that probably that attitude was it might have been a little bit unheard of in the time that she was a strong woman, and she knew what she wanted, and she didn't settle for less, and I admire that about her.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're probably right. I mean, we're talking early 1900s still, so yeah, I doubt that there were too many women who maybe were as bold as that, or maybe there were and we just don't hear about them as often, but certainly she stands out for her, her strength. I mean, she and her perseverance, and she ran the house by herself independently for a long time after that. I mean, she was kind of the sole proprietor, so that just speaks even more to her love for the place and her strength. And really, when you go in there now, you can still feel her there. She's definitely the spirit that most people have encountered there, and more than just her spirit, though, you can feel. I feel like you can feel all of her love, all of her passion, all of her attachment to the building when you go in there. It feels very homey. It's like you're walking into somebody's home still. And I always, myself, I always say hello to her when I walk in, because I'm sort of half expecting her to meet me at the door still.
Yeah, I think that when I was researching this, that's what really stuck out to me, was how much she loved that home and how much time and money and energy she put into that. And so it doesn't surprise me that she carried that love with her into the afterlife. I think that's just a really beautiful story, and it kind of it kind of makes me have a new respect and a new appreciation for the building itself, because I've been in there a few times, but I didn't have any experiences. But I definitely love the story of Mrs. M, and I love how much she cared about that house. You can just tell. And she held on to it for 40 years. That's incredible.
It is. I agree. It really is. I think you're spot on with it. And, it's interesting with the experiences because we've investigated it about 3 times now. And I've, of course, gone in there. And I mean, just about every time I go in there, I have a recorder on me somewhere recording. And we actually, the team, Horns, our team, actually, we have a lot of our meetings there. It's sort of become our home base. And we have kind of an interesting relationship with them as well, because they've also allowed us to be sort of the official paranormal team of the press club. So we actually screen other teams that are coming in, because we want to preserve that, right? That love and that energy that she put into it. We want to make sure that doesn't get disrupted or disrespected, because
Right.
we love the property. I mean, it really, it's like a second home. And so we're fortunate to have that arrangement with them. But the experiences there are fascinating, because it's kind of a mixed bag. Just about everybody who's been going there for a while, if they go pretty regularly, they have some kind of story to tell. Not all of them want to tell it, but most of them have one. But what's interesting, kind of the predominant feeling there, I think a lot among a lot of the board members and members of the club, is that generally you're going to have an experience more if you're being disrespectful in some way. That seems to be when they will kind of make themselves more known. Not always, but that certainly seems to be one of the times. But it's interesting.
So you got to really antagonize them.
You do, and of course we don't want that to happen, right? So we try to make sure that people aren't doing that. We at Horns, we don't believe in provocation. I mean, it's just disrespectful and kind of dumb
and douchey.
It is kind of douchey. I've seen some people do that on a few shows and everything, and they always seem just mad douchey when they're doing it. It's just kind of embarrassing.
We won't name those shows, but everybody knows who we're talking about.
I think you know who I'm talking about.
Absolutely, yes. I know exactly who you mean. I think most people do. Yeah, exactly. No, I couldn't agree more. It really is. It's frustrating, and it's just bad practice. I mean, you're going into someone's home, whether they're corporeal or not. You're still going into their home. And it's just, it's douchey, and we really don't, that's one of the things that we screen for when people say they want to come in. If they're saying we want to, provoke, then it's like, take your Ouija board and go on. Not going to happen.
So you said you've been there 3 times doing investigations. I know you've been there a ton more times, but you've actually done 3 investigations there.
Absolutely. Yeah. We've done 3. We did, I think 2 in 2019, and I think we did all 3 in 2019, come to think of it. The third one was interesting because we actually had made arrangements. We were the first team to ever be able to offer an actual ghost tour of the facility of the home. So we did that in October as a way to let the public come in and kind of have that experience for themselves, which has really not been available before. And then the first 2 were more regular investigations. The first time we went in with, I think, about 14 people so that we could cover a lot of the ground. And then the second time was a smaller one. Lydia was with us, I believe, for both of those, actually. You were there for both of those, weren't you, Lydia? Or all 3 even, maybe?
I did the first one that I don't remember when it was. But yeah, I was there for one of them.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I thought you were there for all 3, but... it's an amazing place. What's fascinating is that the first time I ever went in there, again, it is a site that, like you said, it's pretty famous. Notoriously, if you Google paranormal in New Mexico, it's probably one of the first things you find is the press club. And I went in there originally to kind of start trying to lay the groundwork for an investigation. And even the first time I walked in there, I was going through the building. I was taking photos everywhere. And I was standing at the top. There's a staircase. It's an interesting building. If you haven't been in there, I know you said you have, but for those who haven't, it's basically 3 stories on the outside, but inside it's like 9 different floors, right? So 9 different levels. It's wild. It reminds me of the Winchester House on a smaller scale, but it's beautiful. And so I was on this floor that looks down into the pool room. And of course, you primarily hear about Mrs. M's spirit in the building, but I was looking down the stairs, getting ready to take a photo, and I saw somebody walk by the bottom of the staircase. And of course, I went running down to see who this was, because I knew there were only 2 other people in the building at that time but me, and they were both up upstairs. So I'm like, who is that? And I ran down, and of course, no one's there. But I saw this male figure with a blue shirt and like a hat on, and I was like, oh,